This video is sponsored by Squarespace. There's an article called Debunking the Fictitious History of the Blancpain 50 Fathoms, and it starts, readers of Perezcope know my low tolerance for nonsensical fairy tales in the world of watches, after having dealt for years with all the hogwash spread by modern panerai, and that was a lot. I can literally smell made-up stories from miles away. When I first watched Jeff Kingston's lecture about the history of the Blancpain 50 Fathoms at the Horological Society of New York in 2019, he implied on several occasions that the Rolex Submariner was a rip-off of the 50 Fathoms. Yeah, he did do that. I cannot fault Perezcope for that at all. We'll get more into that in a second. I immediately felt he was trying a tad too hard to push a narrative which on closer examination had no basis in reality. Now, the lecture was nothing but advertising for Blancpain, and of course, Mr. Kingston is not an independent scholar, but an employee of the brand. As such, everything that comes out of his mouth needs to be taken with a grain of salt. By the way, I've been to Horological Society of New York meetings. I can't believe you can even write about those meetings like this. They are just people like... So in 1954, watches had two hands, and we introduced coating them in nickel, which was pretty cool. And the audience is like, oh, nickel, okay. So it's fun that Perezcope writes about these, like, this man was not a 70-year-old scholar that loves watches. Everything that comes out of his mouth needs to be taken with a grain of salt. The false narrative pushed by Blancpain since 2002 that the 50 Fathoms was launched in 1953, and since 2007 that it even was the very first modern dive watch is easy debunked for people who appreciate facts over what ambitious brands and hired scholars have to say. It needs to be said that this article is not meant to ruin the 50 Fathoms in any way, but simply to set the record straight. I myself am a big fan of the original 50 Fathoms. The modern ones, not so much. A great watch like this with a unique design does not need made-up stories, even if it was just one of many dive watches inspired by the Rolex Submariner. I don't think I agree with Perezcope on this one that much, or at all. What is up, everyone? My name is Michael. There is no Christian here. He is not hiding in plain sight. He's not over there. He's not over there. And if he was, he would be hiding until October, which would be weird enough. That's a long time to try to pull off a joke that no one wants to happen. Christian is in Italy on vacation. Speaking of dive watch history, he probably got so excited that I was going to do this video about Blancpain that he went for an extended diving trip in Italy. But I just got back from Maine, had a lovely time, so now he's going to Italy for a month, so it evens out. Just kidding. I always have to make a joke when Christian's on vacation. He deserves it. He works very hard. Anyway, so this article came out by Perezcope. If you don't know who Perezcope is, he is the leading finder of fake things. He blows the lid off of, or the most notable, the first thing he did was blow the lid off of Panerai and a lot of their marketing, which was not correct. What they were doing was not correct. What he was saying was correct. Recently, he talked about Adam Levine's Frankenstein watches. He also talked about the giant Omega fraud. He has a lot of really cool articles, and he writes like a TMZ journalist at the Watch Society of New York, which is a very interesting combination because it used to be, for a while, watches were a very, very stuffy thing. They still are in certain places, but sometimes they get a little spicy with captions like Phillips caught doctoring engravings with Photoshop, Tropical Speedmaster, a record-breaking Omegaga at Phillips. Either way, Perezcope is great. I'm a huge fan. He was hired by a lot of auction houses to find fake watches. The story goes that Perezcope, and I'm saying this from Christian, was hired by auction houses to say, is this watch real? Is this watch fake? Down to every specific part level. And then he said, hey, this watch is fake. And auction houses said, actually, how about you're fake? And we don't believe you, so we're going to sell it anyways. And now we have the legend that is Perezcope. So I do want to say, I totally understand why Perezcope writes about these things. They are needed in the watch industry. There is definitely shady stuff going on in the watch industry all the time. And there is honestly probably some facts that are not correct, or some things that Blancpain says are fact that are not correct. There's also probably some things that Rolex say that are not correct. But either way, Perezcope, Jose, brings a very cool aspect to the watch world, especially as it gets bigger and watches sell for more and more and more. You need, hopefully, a lot of people like Perezcope to keep it in check, to make sure there's not a lot of corruption happening, which there is. So either way, let's dive into this article, because like I said, I just don't believe it that much at all. Or I don't believe there is this horrible thing happening with Blancpain lying. I could be wrong. Perezcope did a lot more research than me, especially because my research and the conclusions that I came to is based off of his research and also Jeff Kingston's. And like I said before, I can see why Perezcope was kind of upset by Jeff Kingston's talk, because it was anti-Rolex at some point, and I think he was trying to go, I watched the entire video, I think Jeff Kingston was trying to be silly, but it did come off as very poo-poo Rolex, which to me is okay, because Rolex is a mammoth. They take up most of the watch industry, and they are one brand. So Blancpain can be a little pokey if they want to be. Not that it's the classiest thing to do that, because everybody knows about Rolex and the history and stuff like that. But in this case, when he was trying to draw conclusions that Rolex blatantly copied Blancpain, I can't say for sure, but we'll get into the nitty-gritty of that at the end. Because Christian and I have flown to different watchmaking hubs across the world, and you notice something when you go to all these watchmaking hubs, and we'll touch on that last, and we'll touch on the most obvious fact of all of this, of why I don't necessarily believe in the article. But I have a lot of points we need to get to before there, so let's do it. This article has already been the subject of a massive debate on the Watch You Seek forums. The article has been updated by Perezcope frequently, so it's a live article, so if I'm saying something that doesn't seem like it's in the article or is changed or something like that, that it seems like I'm just making it up now, the article is probably changed. But I definitely suggest you read the Watch You Seek forum for a more in-depth discussion as well. Oh, and I almost forgot to do a wristwatch check. Sorry about that. I'm trying to implement them more frequently in videos. Today, I am wearing a watch that I've wanted for a very long time. I have photographed the original because Christian has sold many before on the Theo and Harris watch shop. But this is the modern day Hamilton Pilot Pioneer. What I really like about this watch is that although it's a modern day watch, it has not been updated in size. I feel like normally this would be a 42 millimeter watch, just because watch companies like to blow up vintage watches, but Hamilton didn't update this one. It uses the H50 movement, 80-hour power reserve, fantastic watch, and I actually got it from Huckberry, who is also a partner of Theo and Harris. They have a great watch shop. It's not vintage watches like Theo and Harris, but if you ever ask the question, what should I get that person? What watch should I get them? Huckberry is the perfect place to go for that specific reason. You can find watches like Hamilton, you can find Zodiac, G-Shock, Seiko, whatever you want for that person that's just getting into watches, Huckberry 100% has. So thank you so much to Huckberry for sending me the Hamilton Pilot Pioneer. I'm actually very excited. The link for this specific watch is in the description, but I highly recommend that you check out Huckberry as a whole. Okay, so the article starts off with Perezcope saying, Blancpain claims the 50 Fathoms was launched in 1953, 1 year before the Rolex Submariner. A launch is commonly understood to be the debut of a new product and making that product generally available for purchase. That is the most important sentence in this entire article, because if that sentence was not there, this article can't be published, because I believe Perezcope is saying something in that sentence to then protect him the rest of the article and to be able to poke people that are being like, I don't think that's what Blancpain meant. So he has to define release himself. Anyways, let's summarize the article. Perezcope says there is no evidence to back up Blancpain's claim. If they dig into old watch journals, there's no mention of a dive watch made by Blancpain or Rayville, which was Blancpain's name for a little bit, then it went back to Blancpain, so that is the same brand if I mention that later. There are no mentions of this revolutionary new dive watch in 1953 and no mentions in 1954. And if it was a revolutionary dive watch, as Blancpain said it was, and as Rolex also said it was, that would definitely be in journals across the world talking about watches. He goes on to say that the first time this brand, Blancpain, essentially, was listed was in 1955 when they had a small corner display at Basel Watch Fair, which took place between April 16th and April 26th, 1955. There is no mention of any watches presented by them, but if we look at the displays, we can see it had an aquatic theme with fish as a background. The famous picture of Rayville SA director Jean-Jacques Feitcher in scuba diving gear and, whatever. He's saying it's a very water-themed display, which makes sense because, obviously, they have the 50 Fathoms. He then goes on to say, obviously, this was the launch of the 50 Fathoms, which took place in 1955, not 1953, as falsely claimed. What's interesting, he says, is that the watch was not mentioned anywhere as there was nothing innovative about it. That is a huge detail that we need to talk about later, because the Submariner and the 50 Fathoms are advertised as extremely innovative watches. And they are, for some reasons, but not the reasons that I think we thought they were. And we'll get to that at the end of the article, but that is a very big thing right there that Perezcope is saying again. He goes on to say, it was one of the many Me Too products that followed the presentation of the Submariner in May 1954. Perezcope loves Rolex. I don't know if you know that. The Submariner, on the other hand, was mentioned in horological journals around the globe. The image below is an excerpt from May 1954 of the British Horological Journal, in which the new Submariner was described in great detail. A very interesting point that I read from a commenter about this was the line that it was found in the May 1954 edition of the British Horological Journal. Rolex started off in London and then moved to Switzerland, so it would make sense for a British journal to have a little bit more pride about Rolex in particular. And when they were talking about Rolex watches, they said the third rugged waterproof watch is the Submariner, of particular use to underwater swimmers who now penetrate to astonishing depths. Me too. With their oxygen equipment, flippers, underwater cameras, and other devices. They also have a rotatable bezel, which is scaled to 60, although the red end, well, whatever. They're basically outlining the watch. It is also important that they mention that it had a rotating bezel. Perezcope says, at this point, Blancpain's claim is already debunked. But let's look at a series of documents that were presented by the brand to prove their point. I would not say that anything is debunked yet, but I can see why he's saying that. Basically, nobody mentioned the 50 Fathoms coming into the world, being sold when it was the most revolutionary dive watch of all time, but the Submariner was mentioned. So that means the Submariner was the revolutionary one. The 50 Fathoms was not. Although this is a British horological journal, and I feel like it would be in a lot of different sources if it was that big of a thing. This video is sponsored by Squarespace. If Christian was here, I would say, do you need a website or a domain? And he'd say, I already have two, but they made my business. I would not be where I was today without Squarespace. I would have had to pay someone, a ton of money to make a website that was simple, fast, and easy to use. And even if you already have a website that's not through Squarespace, I highly recommend you check them out because it's a pain to have to update something over time when Squarespace has thousands of themes that are at your fingertips whenever you need them. And he'd say that, and then I would say, yeah, and Squarespace is making it easier than ever to design a website with their fluid engine. If you want to blog on Squarespace, they make that also very easy. You can schedule things in advance. And if you're planning on scaling your business to have a physical retail shop, or if it already has one, Squarespace has a point of sales system too, so you can grow with Squarespace to limitless sizes. And then we both say in sync at the same time while pointing at each other. So if you need a website or domain, I highly suggest you check out Squarespace. You can check out the link in our description and use code Theo Harris to save 10% off your order of a website or domain. Then this is very interesting. The co-director of Blancpain, Blancpain essentially filed a patent application for some of the 50 Fathoms features on June 19th, 1954, 1 month after the Rolex Submariner had already been presented in Basel. Wait, what? Perezcope says? Yes. And this is how Blancpain tries to gaslight the watch community about this obvious discrepancy. They say, at the time, patent applications were filed once the product was commercialized, so his first patent application was filed early in 1954. This ties very strongly to the first sentence in this article. Then he says, for anyone who knows a thing or two about patents, this does not make any sense. Patent applications are filed to protect an invention, and this needs to occur as soon as possible in order to stay ahead of the game. Rolex, for instance, filed a patent application for the rotating bezel construction as early as February 5th, 1953, more than a year before Blancpain. The patent for a newly developed crown named Twin Lock, which is also very cool, talk about that, which kept water out even when the crown was pulled out to the time-setting position on April 1953. The Twin Lock crown is an important detail which will be discussed later on. He then says, following Blancpain's nonsensical explanation, Rolex would have commercialized the Submariner in 1952. But that was not the case, was it? Another important thing to consider related to the patent is that even the earliest 50 fathoms examples supposedly made in 1953 have patent plus pending markings. Patent pending is a designation whose usage is only legal once a patent application has been submitted. It becomes evident that all of the mentioned watches claimed to be from 1953 are actually from 1954 or later, certainly from a time after the patent application was filed. This, to me, is the strongest argument in the entire article. A similar situation can be found with the 50 fathoms trademark registration, which was filed on June 11th, 1954 in Switzerland. This fascinating document was unearthed by the great Nick Gould. More interesting than the registration date is the date of first use in commerce, which is noted as August 30th, 1954, so after the Submariner. Then we get into the big meat and potatoes. We're not talking about documents or anything else now. We're talking about the French Navy. There is a debate on whether Blancpain modified their 50 fathoms watch to please the French Navy by basically adding an iron shell to make the watch less magnetic, or if the French Navy commissioned the entire 50 fathoms and Blancpain made the watch for the French Navy, which would definitely date it after the Submariner in 1954. In the old days, it was common knowledge among collectors that the 50 fathoms had been designed by the French Navy and that Blancpain just produced the watches according to specifications. The main driving force behind the projects were Captain Bob Maloubier, a highly decorated World War II hero, and Lieutenant Claude Riffaud. Together, they established the first dedicated French underwater unit known as the French Underwater Unit. I'm not even going to try to read that French phrase. The captain explained on several occasions how they designed the watch, then proposed it to a French watch company who declined to make it, and later finally met with Blancpain, who agreed to produce the watch for them. The captain says, finally, there was this small business, something else very important we'll talk about, Blancpain, that agreed to supply a watch that we imagined with a black dial, large numbers, clear indexes in the form of triangles, circles, and squares, as well as a rotating exterior bezel with markers matching the dial. We had hoped to be able to commence a dive and position the bezel so as to be able to read the time using the large minute hand. We wanted each of the markers to be as prominent as a pole star for a shepherd. That's a very cool ending line, Captain. Love that you had a little poetic flair in your writing. Perezcope says, this is a very interesting statement by the captain, as it mentions clear indexes in the form of triangles, circles, and square, all of which cannot be found on what is typically seen as the earliest 50 fathoms dials with 3, 6, 9, 12 markers. Some of the earliest watches, however, do indeed feature a dial with clear indexes in the form of triangles, circles, and square, as described by the captain. Now, what does this remind you of? Perezcope says. Of course, it is a copy of the Rolex Submariner dial. Again, we'll touch on that later. As said, some of the earliest known case numbers feature this dial type, which poses the question, was this the first iteration of the 50 fathoms? Note also the triangle on the bezel. Later versions had a rhombus instead. Was it changed because it was too obvious it had been copied from the Rolex Submariner? Could be. Okay, now here is something very interesting that John Kingston in his speech mentions, and Perezcope also mentions, but in two different forms. So, knowing that since September 1953, ex-naval officer Jacques Cousteau was wearing a Rolex Submariner, is it far-fetched to think that the captain saw the Submariner on the famous explorer's wrist? I do not think so, as these guys were all in contact with each other. In December 1953, for instance, Cousteau was part of the crew of the French Navy's bathyscaphe, originally designed by these people and descended to a depth of this depth, the national, whatever. Anyway, here is a more recent quote from the captain, seen in the 50 Fathoms history documentary directed and written by Jeff Kingston for Blancpain. The captain says, "So we got a ruling pen, some compasses, some graph paper, and we tried to design our dream watch. The ideal watch for diving, which featured everything we wanted, meaning, of course, luminous letters, not too many numbers, a rotating bezel, etc., etc. We drew up everything we had in mind. We proposed it to this watch company, which laughed in our face. They said, diving watches have no future. Through the intermediary of Spirotechnique, now Aqualung, we got in touch with Blancpain, the oldest Swiss watch brand. They, on the other hand, agreed to make our watch, and so they made it for us. It was 50 fathoms. Perezcope says, and Jeff Kingston also says this, Blancpain is claiming the 50 fathoms was already in production and that the French Navy's only contribution was the anti-magnetic cover. In his lecture, Mr. Kingston said, the captain never met the guy that was wearing the Submariner, but Claude Riffaud did, and the 50 fathoms was in existence at that point. There was only one change which the French asked to be made, and that was to put in protection against magnetism. That was the French addition to the 50 fathoms that otherwise had been fully completed and was in production at that point. And that, we'll break this part down because I'm going to forget to talk about this if I skip over it for now. But what is so fascinating here is the line that through the intermediary of Spirotechnique, now Aqualung, we got in touch with Blancpain. Aqualung, I don't know the full history, but they were basically a diving gear company. Blancpain made dive watches for Aqualung, branded Aqualung. I'm assuming these people got in touch with Blancpain because they liked the watches that Aqualung had, which were early versions of the 50 fathoms to some degree. I believe they were a little different, but that kind of confirms already that those watches were in existence and that these people were using them and liked them, but they probably did have some changes, namely to the dial, which Blancpain says is not true, it's just a soft iron case on the inside. But I would believe that they saw this Aqualung Blancpain and said, we would like to change some things about it, and Blancpain said, sure. That to me is a pretty concrete data point that there was already a dive watch in production. It did get modified, but there was something already there at this time. Now, Perezcope says, coming back to this letter, there are two sentences of importance that help us understand in what time frame all of this happened. Them finding the watch, them contacting Blancpain, all of this. They're translated, but it says, I acknowledge the receipt of the Blancpain watch number 166 Marine Nationale 2. I have the honor to inform you that I am very satisfied of this type of watch that we have been using for a year for our diving exercises. This man was replying to a letter from Spirotechnique dated February 3rd, 1955, which probably accompanied a 50 fathoms with number 166 delivered that day. Given the dates in question, it became clear that the Navy started testing and using these watches only in 1954, and by February 1955, Blancpain had produced just 166 pieces of the 50 fathoms. If the watch was launched and commercialized in 1953 as claimed, why did it take so long for Blancpain to file the patent application and register the 50 fathoms trademark? He says, this whole story makes no sense, even by the low logical standards the modern Blancpain brand is applying. Again, that first sentence, very important. We'll touch on that in a second. A little micro review of this section. From what I can tell, the 50 fathoms itself, the watch that you think of when you say the 50 fathoms, is one of many iterations, but the first to have the real stamp of 50 fathoms. Some were stamped Aqualung, other things had different stamps, there were mil-specs, there were all these different things. I don't know what year all of those things were. I think the Aqualung was the oldest of those, but I believe that 166, 50 fathoms number 166, was probably the first batch of the 50 fathoms watch actually branded 50 fathoms. I can't say that for sure. I am just kind of inferring based off of other data, but that I can't really back that up. Perezcope then goes into detail about crown gaskets, how Rolex had the twin lock crown. They were testing things in 1953. They were filing patents. There was stuff happening with the Submariner in 1953. There's no doubt about that. Perezcope ends this section by saying, as all of this evidence shows, Rolex was way ahead of the game. There is zero evidence to support Blancpain's nonsensical claims to have produced the world's first modern dive watch. Which I will say, there is virtually no evidence that Blancpain did anything first at all. There really isn't. Well, at least Blancpain hasn't shown any, and it's very hard to find any evidence of it at all. But that does not mean you win. That means you don't have evidence, essentially. And we'll get into the meat and potatoes of that later, but essentially, Blancpain is called out throughout this entire article, in Jeff Kingston's speech, everything, a tiny brand, a small brand. Jeff Kingston is like, look at this tiny little house that they lived in. This was not a massive brand. This wasn't a brand with a ton of marketing prowess, which is really a big tie-in at the end. And then the culmination of all of this beef, Jeff Kingston mentions this, and Perezcope mentions this. There's a picture of Rene Paul Jeanneret, I'm sorry, I'm going to say all of these names wrong, with Jean-Jacques Feicher. This is just mutilating names. It's terrible. AKA a picture of Blancpain hanging out with Rolex. Jeff Kingston says Rolex probably looked over at Blancpain's wrist and said, wow, I bet I can make something like that. And Perezcope says Blancpain looked at Rolex's wrist and said, wow, I can make something like that. So, they just crash into each other there. There's not a lot of evidence supporting either thing. Someone's wearing a watch, but it's blurry. Perezcope then goes on to say, essentially, these watches were not the first watches that could go underwater, although most people did not take their watches underwater. You could take a Rolex Oyster underwater. There was a whole film produced in 1953, I believe, where all of these Italian divers are wearing pre-Rolex Explorers while swimming, and they held up just fine. So Rolex has a very deep diving history. So essentially, Perezcope is then saying, like, okay, essentially, look, Rolex has the history, they have the resources, they have this, they have that, so they are the winners. There is literally a film in the 50s at this exact era of experienced divers already preferring Rolex. So they came out first. Then he says this, his thoughts, and I will read them verbatim. Here is what I think happened. It is possible that the French people designed the watch in late 1953, but it was not until 1954. I'm sorry that I'm mispronouncing the names and saying these people. I'm just going to say things wrong. I don't know what is the lesser of two evils, so I'm just mixing it up. Here's what I think happened. It is possible that these people designed the watch in late 1953, but it was not until 1954 that the first examples were produced and tested. In May 1954, Rolex presented the Submariner in Basel, which led Blancpain to realize the commercial potential of the 50 fathoms. Subsequently, he applied for the trademark and the patent. Starting in late August 1954, he began to sell the first watches to the public. Then, in April 1955, the 50 fathoms was presented to a larger audience at the Basel Watch Fair. The history of the Rolex Submariner is quite well documented. There is no unsubstantiated claims or accusations that another brand stole intellectual property. The crown is the crown, after all. The patents for the bezel and twin lock crown were filed in February 1953 and April 1953, respectively. The first Submariner batch was produced in the second quarter of 1953, right after the invention of the twin lock crown. The production took place between April and June 1953. In May/June 1953, a Submariner watch was given to Dmitry Rybakov for testing purposes. Jacques Cousteau received his watch in September 1953. Thoroughly tested, the Submariner was finally presented to the world at Basel Watch Fair in May 1954. The Blancpain 50 fathom story, on the other hand, is inconsistent, illogical, and shrouded in contradictions. It is all claims, no proof. The patent was filed in June 1954, and the explanation that back then patent applications were filed once the product was commercialized is nonsensical. Following this rule, the Submariner would have been commercialized in 1952. Also, all known early watches bear the patent-pending markings, making clear they were made after June 1954. Finally, according to the trademark registration, the first commercial use of the name 50 fathoms occurred on August 30th, 1954, and as we have learned, the watch was only presented to the public in May 1955. My man Gary Getz made a good point. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it sure does not look good for Blancpain's bold claim. I agree with Gary. I think this article has clearly established the 50 fathoms was not launched in 1953, and there is hard proof that the Rolex Submariner was already in production in the second quarter of 1953. The 50 fathoms was a great and proven design that did not need to be supercharged with hot air. Mark Hayek, CEO of Blancpain, did a great disservice to his brand by trying to push the false narrative that the 50 fathoms was the first modern dive watch in history when it clearly was not. As usual, all of the mainstream watch media outlets, my friend Gregory Pons of businessmontrez.com likes to call them, the parrot media, repeated Blancpain's nonsense unreflected in order to cater to the mighty Swatch group. Furthermore, it is truly sad to see guys like Jeff Kingston trying to fool watch enthusiasts with made-up stories. Oh, one more thing. Just as with vintage Omega Speedmasters, the Swatch Group has been rigging auctions for early Blancpain 50 fathoms as well. The prices achieved at auction have to be taken with a grain of salt. If you found yourself in a bidding war over 50 fathoms, chances are you were bidding against someone at Swatch Group who was using multiple accounts to make the watch appear more popular than it actually was. Thank you for your interest. That last part might be true. I have no idea. The rest of this, again, and a few people commented this on the article and on Perezcope's Instagram, which is great Instagram. I definitely recommend that you check it out. Still big fan of Perezcope and everything. But as much as Perezcope shows things and talks about things, there is no smoking gun, which I'm parroting from a comment on his Instagram. Quick interruption. If you have children in the room and you're listening to this, I'm about to talk about Santa, and I don't want them to know any secrets about how he delivers gifts. To which Perezcope replied, what is the smoking gun that Santa Claus does not exist? Because I guess there's no evidence that Santa Claus doesn't exist unless you tell your kids Santa's coming and then you don't put presents out, and then all of a sudden, I guess he doesn't exist. Or the fact that we just clearly, it's accepted by the entire world that he's made up. There's a few things that you could probably argue about Santa, but no need to talk about him right now.
Whether you're a Submariner guy or a 50 Fathoms guy or a Day-Date guy or an FP Journe guy, you've got to just take a step back and appreciate this history here. This isn't stuff you're going to find in a showcase. This is not mass-produced stuff, which is beautiful in its own right. I mean, this is treasure hunting.
Okay, so now my run through. First thing, John Kingston, yes, he is employed by the Swatch Group at large. Is he lying about information? I don't think so, but he definitely danced around during his speech a little bit in terms of like not saying certain things and saying other things. It is not truly unbiased information in the slightest. I also don't know if Perezcope's information is non-biased. Seems like he really hates the Swatch Group, which I don't know the Swatch Group that well. Haven't met them personally. He has his reasons, but it does seem like he doesn't like them very much. So are either of these sources non-biased? I don't know. Did Perezcope do a lot of research? Yes, he did. Did John Kingston? He says he's been studying this for 10 years, so I would assume so as well. Anyways, first thing we need to dig into is the first sentence. Like I said, the first sentence, Blancpain claims the 50 Fathoms was launched in 1953, 1 year before the Rolex Submariner. A launch is commonly understood to be the debut of a new product and making that product generally available for purchase. Okay, that could be what it's commonly understood to be. That could also not be what Blancpain means. Not that either one of them is right. If a watch company says they launched something in 1953, I do think that means it was made to the public, but they could also mean, no, it was, we had it and it was being used by divers by this very niche group that we made for in Switzerland that never left Switzerland. Does that mean it wasn't made before the Submariner? Not really. So the definition of launch comes into play here a lot. Then we'll kind of go through the article quickly. The opening where he's talking about that there was no horological journals talking about Blancpain's debut, the 50 Fathoms debut, I should say, okay, but also there seemed like there was only one from a British horological journal for the Submariner, which isn't as grand as he may have made it seem, that it would be in journals everywhere. That's not a lot. Also, Rolex has ties to London. Maybe there is some pride there. He then, right after that, says the first time Blancpain was mentioned was in 1955 when they had a small corner display at the Basel Watch Fair, which took place between April 16th and April 26th, 1955. Very interesting because this article also didn't talk about the 50 Fathoms. And I would think, even though it was 2 years later, if it was never talked about before, it may be interesting for the watch article to say, by the way, Blancpain also has a great dive watch called the 50 Fathoms, but they didn't say anything, which makes me think maybe it was released before. Also, very interesting comment that I screenshotted. Commenter Watch to Do Today said, in your article, you say there is no mention of Blancpain in horological journals prior to 1955 after the Basel Fair, but I was able to locate multiple articles where Blancpain is mentioned, including as the successor to Blancpain Virouet on the Watch Library website. Do you mean there is no mention of the diving watch? If not, please have a look. Perezcope says, yes, of course I mean the watch. Something so revolutionary like a modern dive watch would have definitely been discussed in all horological journals around the globe, as was the case with the Rolex Submariner. To which someone replied, so you're assuming. Your article makes it sound like they'd never even appeared before that mentioned date. I would agree with the commenters in that area. Okay, so now, finally, here is Mikey's little breakdown. So I think the first thing is that the Submariner, the 50 Fathoms, the Seawolf are all revolutionary in their own way. You could say the Seawolf actually could have been the first watch because it was very close. It was at least tied with Rolex, but they're all revolutionary in their own way. But water resistance was not the revolutionary thing at the time. It was, but people weren't diving that deep at the time. Scuba diving was a rather novel thing at the time. It was getting more and more popular, but it was still like, wow, look at that. It's like, there's a possibility I could now dive. That's cool. So then you would probably say, well, the bezels were very important, which they were, but these were not the first rotating bezels ever put on a watch. So it's revolutionary that you put it on a watch for diving, but it's not a revolutionary technology. And Perezcope shows off the Longines Weems, which is a very beautiful watch, which had a rotating bezel because rotating bezels were very common in aviation watches, albeit they were not unidirectional, but neither was the first Submariner, I think. I could be wrong about that, but the 50 fathoms was definitely not, but it was a locking bezel that you had to push down to turn, so that way you didn't bump the bezel and change the time of your dive. So the bezel was also not exactly revolutionary, but the styling of it was. So you'd think, okay, well, the water sealing technology was revolutionary. And that is where I believe you would be right, because diving with watches was not something seen as crazy, because we all know about the Omega Marine that debuted in 1932 and could already go to 73 meters and was lab tested to 135 meters, which was very deep, much deeper than people were diving at this time anyways. And as Perezcope says, people were already diving with Rolex Oysters. That was not a new thing. So it was the bezel, the crown, the sealing was upgraded and a new style, but I don't know. I had the impression for a while that nothing could really go in the water like these watches, and that's true, but it's not as crazy as I had originally thought. Still not disproving anything yet, just saying some information to get to that point. Okay, now the dissection. We have to talk about Jason Harrier, who commented on Perezcope's article. I think he commented on the Instagram as well. And he says, number one, Blancpain never claimed to commercially offer the first dive watch. They claim it was the first created and initially was offered only to the military. Launching to the public at a watch fair in 1955 doesn't change that timeline and actually makes sense if Blancpain's claims are true. Number two, the 1954 patent also aligns with Blancpain's claim. At the time, patents were assigned on first-to-invent basis rather than first-to-file. There was also likely a year grace period between public use and filing requirements. So a 1954 filing date very well could correspond to a 1953 invention date. Number three, trademarks indicate a source of a good or service in commerce. Blancpain didn't need to trademark registrations until the 50 fathoms was offered to the public, as opposed privately to the military. So the later trademark applications aren't evidence contrary to Blancpain's claims either. Perezcope says, no, Blancpain claims that the watch was already in production when the Navy came knocking. As for the rest of your points, I made my view crystal clear in the article. To that, I would say, well, I believe it was proven because Aqualung already had a watch made by Blancpain when the French Navy was designing a watch that they liked that I believe was based off of the Blancpain Aqualung, not yet named the 50 fathoms. Jason then wraps up. Perezcope, Jason, and Al go back and forth, but Jason says, and basically, Perezcope says, look at this video, listen to what Mr. Kingston says. Jason says, Blancpain has never claimed the 50 fathoms was commercially available in 1953. You're confusing the fact that the watch was in production with being commercially available. Jeffrey Kingston is correct in the clip below. The watch was being produced, likely in small numbers, and this does not mean it was also being sold to the public at that time. To which Perezcope says, Blancpain claims that the watch was launched in 1953, which is commonly understood as a debut of a new product to the market and making it generally available for purchase. So the entire article hinges on the word launched. If Perezcope didn't put that first sentence that said, this is what launched means to me, I don't think this essay holds water. Pun. Kind of a pun. So essentially, again, I do not have a lot of information. I'm going off of Jose and Jeffrey Kingston. But to me, I fully agree with Jason in this example. I would need more evidence to actually say something, but I do fully agree with what Jason is saying. I also kind of think Perezcope may as well, because you don't put that much definition into the word launched unless you know you're going to get a lot of flack, because people are going to say, hey, well, it was made, it was existing, but it wasn't being sold to people like Michael. Anyways, here is what I think happened. I wrote it down, so I will be short and concise. World War II has ended. There was a strong rejection of combat-looking watches. They were not popular. Field watches, steel, whatever. The general consensus was no, gold watches, dressy, classy. We are not going to be wearing our field watches out and about. Blancpain, if they were telling the truth, had a 50 fathoms watch, probably with a military focus that they figured would be small batch orders from military groups around the world with different customizations. Some like triangles, some like numbers, some like rhombus, whatever it may be. They played with dials a lot and weren't too worried about patents or showing this watch off, since commercially successful watches just didn't look like that at the time. They were gold leather band watches. Diving also at the time was extremely new, so I don't blame Blancpain for thinking, who on earth is going to buy this watch? Then the marketing genius that is Rolex and has always been Rolex says, hey everyone, diving's a really cool recreational thing, and you can do it with our watch, and it looks like this, and it has all this cool history, and all this cool technology, and it's super reliable. And oh wait, here is a film that Italian divers made in full color, that is a full-length documentary, where they are also wearing our watches that aren't even the dive watches we made yet, so these watches are even better. Isn't that amazing? And Blancpain was like, wow, so that watch that we've just been selling to the French Navy is really going to be a big thing, isn't it? We better patent that right now. That is not to say that Blancpain didn't look at the Submariner then and say, well, let's make our indice a triangle as well, or let's switch it to a rhombus, or let's do this, let's do that. It's not to say they didn't modify the 50 fathoms after seeing the Submariner, but it is also, all of this is not to say Blancpain is lying. There is not enough evidence to say they are lying. These claims are unsubstantiated. They're trying to trick you. Jeff Kingston is Sean Kingston? There's not enough information to say this is decidedly true. And I think we're arguing over a single word that you can define however you want. But if I had to place a bet with really no other information, I would say that Blancpain probably did not market their watch or sell it commercially before Rolex. They did that after. But there's a possibility that the watch existed before. And finally, there is a huge possibility that the Seawolf, the Submariner, and the 50 Fathoms all just existed and came out at almost the exact same time, because they're all being made in Switzerland, and people go for beers after work, and they say, hey, we're working on this cool watch that people can swim with a rotating bezel, and then people talk about it in town, and then it comes out. It's a local town. Christian and I have been in watchmaking towns where the companies are like, oh yeah, like these guys get lunch with these guys, and they talk about these things, and then that happens. So that is my final summation. This is a much longer video than I thought. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you later.